I am here with a good friend of the show, HapaPerspective. I see him as a commentator and online personality. His Telegram can be found at HapaPerspective. He's also on YouTube. And we were just talking about how you would like to see yourself build. What sort of titles do you have? And you had made a very interesting point about how you wouldn't even see yourself as, a political activist or an intellectual or a commentator. So if you could summarize just what you just said, I thought it was very interesting.
What I was talking about, sort of what roles these people would fulfill in a more natural, like pre-modern world. I kind of, yeah. So what I get with a lot of the people, to my disappointment, a lot of people in the dissident right are sort of like disgruntled peasants. Unfortunately, I wish they weren't. But they don't strike me as like the will to power sort of people that I would want them to be.
What's interesting is that I was thinking about this just the other day, actually, how one of the terms that gets thrown around in our scene is a midwit. And a midwit, for people to know, is kind of a person of average intelligence, but they tend to overestimate how intelligent and persuasive they actually are. And this would be most people. If we're imagining it on a bell curve, I guess they would be the middle. And people get frustrated by the midwit and they don't like communicating with the midwit. But I look around and I see a lot of midwits in our scene, people who are not particularly leadership quality. They don't really have any, what we use the term organizational acumen. Like, they're not very good at gathering people around and giving orders. They seem like just midwits who read a lot of books. And I'm not saying that that's even bad, or that midwits should not read books. But I think one of the issues that we've had with the various leaders who've ran movements and ran groups is they are just kind of, like you had said, they're peasant type people, but they feel like they got to rise up through the ranks and kind of act like a leader, but they don't actually have the missing piece in their skull to be a leader. So they just mime it. And we could probably think of like 10 to 20 people like that over the years who have followed that. And so you're not interested in much of that at all, are you?
Well, so these people you're describing as midwits, I kind of think of it a bit. I don't outright disagree. I think some of them are very intelligent people, but it's like they have a will, but they don't believe in will to power for themselves. And I think that kind of negates the whole point of having a will, because what good is will without will to power?
That's true. And I think that there's a lot of people in this scene, and it sounds like I'm being dismissive of them. I'm trying not to be, because I think it's a problem that must be solved. Like, one example we gave on a recent episode was the people who kind of turned to Christianity, mainly because they're soldiers looking for an army. So if you look at, because I'm Catholic, and I'll see a lot of people who join the Catholic Church because they're just anti-gay. And they hate gay. And previously, they would have joined the Catholic Church because they hated Muslims. And they looked around and said, oh, the Catholic Church it looks like that they're against Muslims, and it's very organized. It looks very regimented. It's kind of structured like a military in a way. And so they joined that, and they find out that it's not what they thought it was. It's not the Pope's new army. And then they usually go to sort of Russian Orthodox because that seems more extreme. And then they find it's not there. Point being that, in a lot of ways, they're soldiers wandering around looking for an army who's going to tell them where to march, and then they can't really find it. But they're looking for someone who's got the attributes of a general to say, tell me where to go. And you'll see people outright say, like, we need a leader. So, there's people who are, just kind of soldiers looking for a general. What do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right about that. And I sense that within this movement and, the political sphere. And I just don't have... I don't think that way. I don't have that instinct. I'm not saying leaders are bad or that I would necessarily hate a good leader. A great leader is great if it's the person you want and they're doing what you want them to, and that's fine. But I don't think that way. That's not how my mind works, I guess. And I don't know what this means about me or where I belong, but I think that's where I kind of butt into heads, or I butt heads with these people, is because they have this sort of, I don't know how you could describe it, this sort of follower mindset that they project onto everyone else. And they'll say things like, it's funny. They'll say that there's too many chiefs and not enough Indians or something. But it's sort of the opposite problem in as far as like mindset is concerned, because even if we had a good leader, it's such a difficult thing to it's like you have a movement and you have the head, and the establishment just has to chop off the head and they can take down the whole movement. And we saw this more or less with the alt-right. Not that Richard Spencer was a good leader, but he was like a single point for them to attack.
That's a good point. Another thing I noticed that's in that same sort of pool was that if anyone's ever been a part of a political group, and it doesn't need to be like a militia or anything, it could be any political upstart, and I've done a couple, what you'll notice is that there's a lot of guys who kind of think they're leadership material, and that's where you butt heads, and that's why these things fly apart, because everyone also thinks that they got the right idea. And usually that's because if you're in the scene, you've probably, no one actually wants to be in the scene. And I'm not saying it's because it's a bad scene, but it's hard. It's hard being here. You can get in trouble. Everyone, like I always joke, everyone could be a fucking millionaire tomorrow if they just wanted to be a shit lib. All these commentators, they could have all their platforms, and if they took the easy route, but they're not. And so you have a lot of people here who got kind of a chip on their shoulder and everything, and they think that they're excluded from mainstream society. So if you are excluded, you are by extension probably a leader, and then they're not. And so you get these, I don't know how many fucking political groups people have been a part of that have just flied apart for this reason. But then there, to your point, I don't, some people will say that, oh, we're just kind of waiting for the next great philosopher king to tell everyone where to go. But to your point, I'm like, yeah, if you're just making the biggest head on a snake possible, well, that presents different problems as well. I tend to take a bit more of a decentralized approach. So I'm just not critiquing people. I actually would be more interested in seeing a more decentralized and distributed kind of web structure of smaller but perhaps interconnected movements, like a cell structure, rather than some kind of new giant pyramid, which I think people are still looking for.
Yeah, it's really a strange dynamic. I really, because then you have these different groups fighting each other, and it's really a bizarre thing where like you have these people in the dissident right. They're all about authority and collectivism, but they all behave as individuals. They can't get along. They can't even follow chat rules, and they hate the police. And it's and they hate moderators, so they don't really, in practice, they hate authority. But they want,
That's a good point. A joke could be like, we wouldn't be here if we were that collectivist, really.
That's actually true. I mean, recently, I finished rereading Kevin McDonald's book, and white people as a race are the product of individualism. Like whites as we know it, they wouldn't look or behave the way that they do now if it were not for individualism. Especially Northern Europeans. So, to do away with individualism would be removing the soul of the white man from the white man. His bio spirit that his sort of directed his evolution from since prehistory.
Yeah, I like that, and this will lead into one of the main things I wanted to talk to you about, because I agree with that, and I get the most pushback on this topic, on the idea people think that individual liberalism or rational individuality, whatever you want to call it, this thing is just a switch that can be turned off or it can be walked back. It's like, oh, we can just turn a switch and be collectivist. But I would make the argument, I'm sure you do too, that this liberal individuality is part of the DNA of European identity. I think it can be broadly European as well. That is just not present in many other ethnic groups.
Really, in no other racial groups. The Northern European race, especially, is genetically the most individualistic, and always has been, always will be, as long as they exist. And you can't switch that off. It's just the nature of how we evolved. As someone that is half Anglo-Saxon, that's my heritage, and it is what it is. And that, I think that pretty much everything is downstream from race, especially politics, as far as that's concerned. I mean, unless you use politics to change the evolution of a race, the genetic evolution, I would imagine, which could happen. But You know what I mean? It's kind of hard to like undo 12,000 plus years of evolution in a
Yeah,
single generation.
and I've seen you kind of take some flack for that too. Now, and I know when I think of HapaPerspective, I think of the things you posted and the videos you've done, and I know you keep coming back to that point exactly. Now, do you find that that sort of thinking is a difficult sell in this scene, or have you received a lot of negative pushback based on just thinking that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I receive pushback all the time. Uh, it's like because these people are sort of a lot of people in the dissonant right. It's like their thinking is just dictated by buzzwords that some figure said, or some memes they saw. So that some memes they saw, so they're constantly trying to criticize individualism, liberalism, rights, democracy. Um, you know, it's really like they don't. I don't even think they really understand these things. I don't feel that they understand why these things exist, or why we have them, or how like I was talking about earlier, Northern Europeans are individualistic by nature. And um it's I mean, I could just go on and on. I got into a debate recently with some people in Philosophy Cats chat. And
What
uh,
was the what happened there, if you don't mind me asking?
so the debate was over rights, and several people were trying to tell me that rights don't exist, right? um But they do exist. They didn't say this. I was trying to explain to them, like, I agree that rights are an abstract concept. They don't exist. Only what's physically tangible exists. Might makes right is the only thing that exists in a sense. Um, but we live in a modern, civilized world with police and courts and lawyers and laws don't exist, but they do because they're legally enforced. And the same applies to rights. If you're going to say that rights don't matter and don't exist, then you have to say that laws and money don't matter and don't exist, but they clearly do. We could talk all day about how money doesn't really exist, but at the end of the day we have to go to work. And that's what I was trying to explain to these people in Philosophy Cats chat. And it just they were just so autistic that it's like they couldn't. They're like, okay, yeah, we got to use these things for now, but they hate these concepts. They hate the concept of rights, but they don't understand that that's the only thing protecting them. And if we didn't have this, they would be totally fucked. You know,
Yeah, yeah. In a sense, the rights are simply a codification of behavior, just like laws. And I think you made a good point where it's like they need to exist to set the standard to live by, because we have them anyway. If they can call rights many different things in society, and if a good example would be like if you're looking from an anthropological point of view at what defines an ethnicity. We talked about this when we talked about the book Albion Seed. Like how you define a group is a folk way. And within a folk way, that's just everything you do, like how you raise your kids, your religion ways, your magic ways. But then there's also, you can break that down into social mores and social taboos. Like, what is a taboo? That is something where if you do it in a society, you will receive some form of indirect punishment from that society or community. And now it's not codified in the law. That's kind of the next step up. After a taboo is a law against the thing. But you can look at rights and you can follow its roots all the way down to, if you want to speak their language, the blood and soil, the spirit of the race, whatever there's a lot you can do, but you can trace the roots down to that thing they kind of understand. And sometimes it's just they don't get it because it's a different word they're trained to dislike, but you can
yeah,
see
they're
the
trained
relationship.
to just reflexively react to these words. And it's like the in they don't understand that rights are protecting what we had in a pre-modern, pre-civilized world. Now we live in the modern civilized world with courts and police and legal processes and this and that. And we don't live in a world where might makes right, and if you're unhappy you just pick up a spear and overthrow the king or something. And I mean, you could even argue that a king as a title doesn't really exist. And but their point is that rights are the reason why we have problems with who's and degeneracy and this and that. And like people will blame freedom of speech for gay rights or something. And I just think that it's just they're really. I don't think that's true as much because the argument they would have to make afterwards is that these aren't these wouldn't be problems in countries where there are fewer rights or no rights. But I mean, the homosexuals are everywhere. I think homosexual culture, LGBTQ stuff is increasing everywhere. I mean, there's a lot of trannies in Thailand. Isn't Thailand under a monarch? I mean, they don't have a Bill of Rights, but you have this stuff everywhere.
One way to look at, because I know this is brought up a lot, because homosexuality sits very, very high on the reason why people do things or are against things. Homosexuality is the reason why a lot of people in the scene are considering becoming Muslim, which is kind of funny.
Oh
Like
my
shit like that. It's
god.
like, I don't see any gays in Islam. Maybe we should all be Muslim. Like that would
Some
sound
of the
so
gayest
insane.
people you'll meet are in the Middle East. I mean,
Yes, this is what I tell them. I'm like, you just don't understand how the culture works. They just lie about it. It's weird. It's a thing that we don't understand because we don't speak their language. But I'm like, the amount of degeneracy that happens within Muslim communities is astounding. They just don't really talk about it in the same way we talk about it. But because homosexuality sits so high in their minds, they'll try and throw in with whatever. But one of the things to look at with the spread of homosexuality, and I know a lot of people might not agree with this, but I heard it explained by a lot of the people who are advocates of the Italian elite theory, and I actually think this is true, because if you look at things like gay rights and abortions, it's not really a free speech issue, because I don't think there's anything about these two things, like trannies, abortion, that is like a mind virus. Most people hate these things, and most people
Yeah,
voted against them consistently up
yeah.
until fairly recently. So the only reason they got where they are is because they figured out a way to tilt the scales by hijacking certain power centers. And then most people, once they realize that, oh, the this is the way things are now according to the power centers, they fall in line. But if you actually leave it up to a free speech thing, most people hate this shit. They just kind
Yeah.
of got used to it over time.
Even in 2022 America, if we had direct democracy, and I'm not shilling direct democracy here, but if we had it, LGBTQ would be banned from schools, from TV. It would be banned. Most people don't support this, and so they can't use it would be it's unrealistic. It's a false idea that these things are the product of democracy and rights. They're not. This stuff is the product of the who tribe, and shifting the blame onto rights and democracy is shifting blame away from who's. But then these same people might complain about like Thule Tide or something for not talking about the who's enough. I mean, it's like it's just you just go full circle with these people. It's like
Yeah. And also, I find that if you take the free speech angle, because there's cases to be made that there are certain speech that shouldn't be allowed, like we won't get into that, but the argument could be made that if you treat these sorts of things like acceptance of homosexuality and transgenderism as sort of a mind virus, it implies that they're natural. They naturally occur if you don't put up certain roadblocks, which is actually what I would argue the liberal capitalist global homo, whatever you want to call it, that's what they want, because their line of thinking is that, oh, there's so many gay children now because we broke down these walls, and this is actually naturally what people are like. So I'm very careful not to enter into that framework because I don't believe it. So I also think like we need to stop all this, get rid of free speech, because otherwise everyone will become gay. No, the reason
that's exactly what they're saying, and it's like, but so it's like if it what these people in the dissident right, and not everybody in the dissident right, obviously, just this faction. It's a very vocal minority in the dissident right. What these people are basically saying is that in a natural world, everyone would be gay and LGBTQ and race mixing, and that's not true. It's, if anything, the opposite is true. And the shit libs, the liberals, the LGBTQ people, they're the ones that want to shred the Bill of Rights because they're using the force of government and corporations to push this stuff, right?
yeah, they're treating we can call this sort of, well, let's make up a new term. Let's call it the fucking global homo industrial complex.
Yeah.
And it's all the NGOs, it's big parts of these governments that they're treating it as what it is, which is just a force amplifier for whatever you plug into it. And they figured out like, oh, if we just plug in gay
The
shit.
government is a big part of it. It is a big part of it.
and I don't complete. There's some people who have different names for this. You know, a lot of the NRX guys call it the cathedral. Guys like Noam Chomsky would call it, you know, this manufacturing consent idea. They kind of place different people at the top of that pyramid. So, you know, I'm not subscribing to any one of those specific designs of how it works, but I think we all know there is some kind of superstructure that seems to exist. That is a force amplifier for a lot of what you might call Western degeneracy. And that's what people respond to when they say, oh, we're invading country X because we want to turn their kids gay. And there is an element to that, too. So, whatever we want to call it, the phenomenon is existing.
Yeah. And that's why, I kind of come at the angle of being like pro collapse, pro small government, pro natural rights, pro freedom. And I think a lot of these problems are a product of an over civilized, modern, over urbanized, over domesticated, world that we live in, a Western world. And I just wish more people within the dissident right would understand that. Like, I think this is sort of because this has happened before in other civilizations that were at the end of their life cycle. Late stage Rome.
And I agree. And I see a lot of people who've clued into that and are trying to actively live in that future and figure out what the best way forward is. Now, there's a lot of people who are doing things that I might disagree with, but then there's some people who are trying to figure out new ways to collectivize. Like, there's various groups. If we're talking about white people, for example, there's a lot of groups who are trying to gather and raise consciousness on white identity. And I say, good for you. There's a lot of people who've got different sort of tracks that they're on, but I think the ones that have the best chance of surviving and succeeding are saying, like, okay, here's the situation on the ground right now, and we're trying to chart a course for a post-collapse America, and we have different ideas of what that'll look like. I think that's a point of disagreement too. Some people think it's going to look like, The Road by Cormac McCarthy, where it's like or like fucking a race war, an actual race war where there's people hanging. There's some people who think that's going to happen. Then there's others who think we'll just be living in Brazil, which is a bit closer to what'll happen. Or the worst of all, which is it'll be like it is now, except slightly worse every 10 years. And then you'll get to a point where the generations don't know any different. That's probably what it's going to be too. But I think we disagree on what that's going to be, and that's why we're always fighting.
Well, all of those are unfortunate. All of those are possibilities, but the one that I think is the most favorable for us is a total collapse, not Brazilification, obviously. And I don't think that would happen. I think balkanization is more likely, and people could consider that a collapse. Like, collapse, it doesn't necessarily mean the end of civilization or technology or anything, but just a collapse of the empire. But I think even if something more than that, like a total collapse, would work out really well for us. Because what a lot of people in the dissident right do not seem to understand is that a lot of this diversity is protected, supported, funded, facilitated by the government. They don't understand that, and so when they're asking for more government, they'll say they want more muscular government. That's just going to mean more diversity, more migrants. I mean, these people, they need to spend a month or two in Washington D.C. because that's what it is. It's this like bio-Leninist shithole, as I've put it. And the system, the bigger the empire grows, the bigger and stronger the government gets, the more it wants diversity. Just as the corporations want diversity. And these people the diversity hires, the migrants that come in are perfect for these sort of like bio-Leninist roles that they fill for the government.
I also think that what we've witnessed over the past few years, to various degrees, is the death of the populist dream. I think that was what kind of got Trump elected. There was still this idea on the right that if we elect the right guy who cares about his people, then he will act for those people. And that didn't happen. And there's various reasons why that didn't happen.
But and then people, they'll take that and say, see, populism doesn't work. But I think that's sort of from my Hapa perspective, the way I see it is the problem is just this large government, modern civilization, we're living in this over civilized world. So nothing is going to work as long as the structure is still intact.
And people in many ways are being kept apart by that. There's this book. I always bring this up just because I find it interesting, and I find it can bridge a lot of different groups if we talk about it. It's there's this book called "Democracy: The God That Failed" by Hans Hermann Hoppe, and Hans Hermann Hoppe is often thought of this sort of libertarian, and when you say libertarian, people just throw it in the trash. But I actually quite like the book. It's a very good book, and it's a very pro monarchy book. But at the end, it kind of balances between monarchy and this sort of ethnogenesis in a sense, because near the end of the book, he was kind of making an argument for the pro family and pro community side. He said, you have to ask yourself, what form does a folk or a people take once the state is gone? And he would give the example of Rome. Once Rome falls, how do you get from Rome to Italy? How do you have this thing called the Italian people? So once the machinery of the state disappears, which has happened, which it might very well be happening before our eyes right now, in places like Ukraine, you see in Eastern Europe has had this happen countless times. Once the state vanishes or ceases to exist, what is left over? How do you know you're a people? How do you actually survive as a people without that? And you have to ask, if the American government were to vanish tomorrow, what would happen the next day? And
I think that would benefit. I think that would benefit heritage Americans in realizing their true identity, because if they're so. I think it was a couple of years ago, I found a video about the genetic studies on ancient Roman populations. And what they found was in the later stages of the Roman Republic, going into the Roman Empire phase, when Rome was big and, civilized, they started getting more Semitic admixture, because there are a lot of Semitic migrants, people from the Middle East, kind of like today, that are coming in to Europe. They were coming from the Greek colonies, people from, ancient Syria and God knows where else, it's probably as far as Iraq. And so that changed what was his name? I read his book, but I forget his name. Tacticus, I think his name, or was it Tacitus? When he wrote about the Germans, he described them as being an unmixed people in comparison to his people, the Romans. The Romans were, by the time of the Roman Empire, the Romans were racially a mixed people. So they were like the original Amerimots in that sense, But Americans aren't really Amerimots. But I think that meme is actually more applicable to the Roman people living in the Roman Empire than it is to modern Americans.
And I always bring this book up a lot. A lot of people do, but if people would like to know a bit more about this, can't recommend enough the book "The Ancient City," published by Imperium Press. If you have any interest in like pagan stuff, this is very good for that. It's I haven't heard any arguments why it's bad. I think everyone likes it. But once you do, it actually follows, and it uses Rome as an example. That's why I bring this up. It uses the example of how Rome basically grew out of the domestic cult, the family, which kind of grew into the clan, which kind of grew into the union of clans, how a city was formed and how the city built up into this empire. And you can kind of see how it grows like a tree. But there is a point where, like you'd said, there's a disconnect between kind of the founding stock of the empire, which you can actually trace genetically to these like dynasty families and clans and such, which you can kind of still do in places like South Korea. And then there's a disconnect between that and then this new idea of a citizenry, which is a lot broader. Yes. And everyone talks about the fall of Rome, which is how it was mostly slaves. And then, not to get into this is how you have the rise of Christianity. Yeah, exactly. And it's like, oh, I'm a citizen. They brought in what a citizen is, who can be a citizen. And then it turns out that there's more of them than there are the family stock. And then,
what the conclusion of this study was that the Romans as an ethnic group existed, and they created, the Roman kingdom, and then the Republic, and then they died out. Like the Romans as an ethnic group no longer exist. The Vikings and the Germanic people still exist, because they didn't really try to do empire until later, and by then they could kind of secure their borders. But I think what I'm trying to get at is that civilization, having urbanized civilization like the Romans did, and what America's trying to do, and all over the West, having cities and, it sort of facilitates race mixing, diversity, the destruction of your people. And no, I don't think it's possible for a modern state, a modern, like, a large state with a capital and big cities and civilization. It's not possible to really, unless it's going to be explicitly hyper racist, to use that R word that I hate. Uh, it's not possible for them to preserve their ethnic group.
Well, and I have a question about that. So all that is true, and all of that, I think a lot of people, once they hear that, they agree with it. Do you see, as Hapa perspective, as a Hapa gentleman, a mixed race between white and Asian, do you see yourself as a product of that sort of era in the modern day?
Yeah, I don't see Hapas as a proper race. They're not really. They're not a people. It's not even like, 400 years ago on this island, white people mixed with Asian people, and there's a Hapa, you know, uh, country or something, or tribe. Not at all. It's just these people that, because of modern transportation, people from one corner of the earth were able to meet people from another corner and get into a relationship and form families as individuals. And you have this just sort of disparate, scattered group of people that are half East Asian and half white, black, or whatever. Hapa doesn't mean half white. It means half East Asian. So, someone that's half black could be a Hapa. And so I don't consider Hapas a people. But as an individual, I identify more with my white side. I would love to live in a white ethno state with the same rights as a white person, but I'm not a white person, and I'm very adamant about that. I wouldn't want someone to categorize me as a white person, because I feel like that would set a bad precedent.
Well, I think it's interesting because I've heard a lot of people within your chat and other chats. They're like, what am I going to do with my identity? I feel like I'm a man without a country. And I would always give you as an example. I'm like, well, this guy's got more followers than a lot of straight up white nationalists. And he seems to be making a better case. So he found a way. Now, do you see yourself?
And I'm more of a white nationalist than a lot of these other people. Sometimes that's not naming names. But yeah,
do you see yourself as a role model for these people? Because there's a lot of guys like yourself who feel lost in the wilderness.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I think that. I think that with racially mixed people, there's a fork in the road, and they have to pick a side and advocate for that side. And I think nuanced approaches are the way to deal with these mixed race people. They because like there's another camp, of course, that isn't right. Like all mixed race people should just face the wall, and we'll get rid of them, or we're going to sterilize them. And I think that's inhumane. But I think it's funny, but it's inhumane. But I think the way to deal with it, because I think the way to deal with the racially mixed people question, is to have economic policies that just expand the white population, and that would be very easy to do. Like taking down the military-industrial complex and giving that money to white families. That's something I would support as a racially mixed person. Give my tax dollars to the white people that have no criminal record and want to have 10 kids.
I was going to ask you a question, because you seem to have come out the other side of this identity, being you got a good head on your shoulders, you're not suicidal. I'm sure you have frequented, like, there's a lot of these like Hapa guys who are very, very defeatist and fatalistic. Yeah. Like, oh my God, should I die? Should I kill myself? And
I think that they should just have a normal life, and if they want to, they can have a family, and that would be fulfilling for them. Or join the military, get involved with something, do something, believe in something. I think a lot of the problem that these Hapa men face, because it's like the existential problems that racially mixed people face in general. And so they have their identity crisis going on, and they have trouble fitting into society, and it complicates their finding their position in their place in the sexual marketplace. They have the problems of an Asian man, but they're not Asian, so they don't have we've talked about this. Like, I'm sure you've seen incel TV, like Asian guys are at the bottom of the dating pool, and Hapas kind of have some of the same problems that Asian men have, but they also have this white identity, and it gets even more confusing. And, you know, it really complicates things in a way that I could just talk about all day, and I don't think we have time for that.
But I like it very much so far. I think one thing that Hapas have going for them is they have internalized the Anglo tendency to have more than one type of haircut. I think that helps a lot.
Oh, Asians do that too. I mean, sometimes they'll dye their hair blonde and they'll spike it up or have all kinds of weird.
Yeah, I don't know what Korea's doing right now. There's a lot of wild hair going on over there.
Yeah. But the thing with there's a lot of issues that Hapas face, and they just need to follow HapaPerspective. That's all I'm going to say. That's really. Yeah, go ahead.
It's a brand you can trust. I was going to ask if this is too personal, let me know. But were you raised by your parents in a certain way that you think helped you come out the other side, being emotionally stable, whereas others might not, and it's helped you with kind of grappling with those two sides?
I was raised in a broken household, divorced parents, you name it. They didn't. I made it to the age of I made it to my mid-30s, and things get better as you get older. That would be my message to these, just men in general that are having issues. I had, being of Asian descent, I've had the struggles that a lot of these guys have with women, and I just kind of continued on, and life gets better when you get older, and things become more available. I have a woman in my life now, and I'm probably going to have children at some point. And I have
work. Congratulations. That's good.
Yeah. It's not the end of the world. You don't have to, your life doesn't really start until you're 30 as a man.
I was just saying that the other day. I was speaking, it might have been with the Prudentialist, but I said, once you get to the age of 30, you get this superpower. Being 30 is like having a superpower. Things make sense. And I don't feel like I'm invincible anymore, but I do have this focus that I never had. And it feels like something, maybe that's what wisdom feels like. But once you're in here, you're like, okay, I know exactly what I need to do. And I know exactly what I need to do to get there.
Yeah. And the things that are out of reach, or they seem like they're out of reach, you kind of you take on this Zen-like patience, and then it comes to you.
Well, it's funny because my wife is 5 years younger than me, and I think she looked at me like I had
Same
some
as
kind
mine.
of super.
Well, she's not my wife yet, but yeah.
I was like, I had some, but there's also like men are just kind of better at handling that sort of thing. But also now she's getting kind of catching up, and then not catching up doesn't make any fucking sense, but she's getting older, but she's kind of getting there too. And yeah, it's a funny thing, and I find that the flip side is, and maybe you'll see this, or maybe you're seeing it now, but if you're a man and you're in your 30s and you actually don't have a family, your brain starts doing strange things to you. Because we talk a lot about women when they hit the wall, and then childless women lose their mind. Guys kind of do it too, in a bit more of a subtle way. But if you're in your 30s and you don't have a kid, you're like, okay, what am I doing? Your body starts deciding like, oh, maybe you should just fucking kill yourself. Let's start over.
No, well, I think there's a biological clock that men have one too. It's just later than what women have. But what I'm trying to get at is that like some of these guys have issues because they're incels. I was an incel, and I know some people hate that term, and they'll be like, hey, you can get a prostitute and not be an incel, but that's not when people say they're an incel, like that's not, it's not like it's an inaccurate term. It's, what I mean? What they're saying is they just want a woman that is attractive, that they could marry and have children with, and, so on and so forth. So maybe incel's the wrong, I mean, when I was an incel, I mean, sure, there was the like local town fatty that anyone can get, but nobody wants that. Right. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. And that's a good
some
point,
people, but
we talked about that on the show, where incel, when I recall coming across that term years ago, it was very, very specific. And there were guys who were involuntary celibates who they were the weird ones who would be getting mad at their parents for not buying them prostitutes. But a lot of the guys who get called incel now, if you talk to them, they're just guys looking for love,
They're
essentially.
guys with standards, and their standards aren't they can't find women that meet their standards. I there were when I was an incel, which I guess I wasn't really. There were, of course, there were women that wanted some women that would have been interested in me, but I wasn't. They weren't. They didn't meet up. They were like below average type of women because I was just a young guy. Young guys don't have a lot of value, and that's what I think. Things are just different when you're a young man. But what I'm trying to get at here is once you get older, you take on this zen like patience, and what you want in life comes to you in some form, and it doesn't matter. I mean, like
Just to
what
give an
you can
example,
wait forever. Sorry.
so just to give an example, what you're talking about, there, I do know a. There's going to be a lot of people who hate me for this interview. Like, we got some fans like, "What are you talking about?" I'm basically talking about race mixing, I guess. But I saw this Hapa guy in like one of my offices I worked at, and he was a cool guy, and he had managed to pull like 10 out of 10 fucking blonde British girl with like a successful, and he did it. So I looked at that, I was like, huh, it is possible. And then he's kind of tall too, so maybe that worked for him. But I just use
That
that
does
as an
help.
anecdote where I'm like, maybe it does get better. I didn't think that was possible. I didn't think it happened like that. But this guy, and he
Hey,
was
wait, this guy was a Hapa again?
yeah, he was a Hapa, and I think he was a Hapa who chose the white side because I'd known some mixed race white and Asian guys who seemed to like subtly choose their Asian side. So
I think that's most of them. Most of them do.
yes, they don't have that sort of like brash masculinity because that's what a lot of
At
girls
least the
like.
men, the men do. The women, I think, the Hapa women go to their white side more often, and they date white men, and you see that a lot.
Big time. But the Hapa guys, they pick their Asian side. So, and then there's a certain character that a lot of Asian, like Chinese, especially guys, will have where they're very proper. But white guys, what people tend to like about them is that they're kind of rugged and crazy and weird and, skateboarder shit. So the white guy, the Hapa that kind of pulled it off, like he was very much like a kind of a skatery sort of guy.
Yeah, but see, yeah, he had an identity, and a lot of these guys that are incels, they don't have a purpose in their life that like when a woman, I'm not a relationship expert or anything, but I think women, they want a man with substance to latch on to, a man that they want a man that's going somewhere and they want to be able to go with him, right? And a lot of these young men, and I fell for this when I was a young man, because I didn't have any older male role models in my life to teach me anything. They fall into this trap of like trying to chase what they want, chasing women, chasing money, this and that. And, I'm not saying men shouldn't approach women, but if they're just, like, I don't think if you're chasing something, like, people can smell it, especially women. And that is what leads them into inceldom.
That's 100% what it is. And I've said this before that whatever people want to say about women, there's a lot of criticisms to have. But one thing I think they got going for them is they have this highly evolved creep detector sort of thing.
Yeah,
Now,
yes.
a lot of times, women will call a lot of people guys creeps when they're not. But
Right.
they do. I've seen it work very well in the past where they can sense desperation and like weird horniness on a guy. He could be even a handsome guy. I've seen it work where even handsome, like,
Yeah.
ew, no. But just funny it's funny you should mention that because I've talked about this on the show before. So I hope people aren't bored with this. But when I was in my late teens and very early 20s, I kind of fell in with a pickup artist community.
Yeah, I did too. I did too.
Yeah. And this
Yeah.
would have been in Toronto, and this was before there was a name for it.
And in
This town called
Toronto, that you have to. I mean, you feel like you have to do that because I just hear like it's like Washington D.C. It's just horrible.
it's crazy. This would have been how many, like a decade ago, I guess.
Yeah.
But I didn't really know much about it. Its reputation didn't precede it at the time, and I kind of this guy I knew. He's like, "Oh, come to these meetings and stuff." And what I saw was a lot of guys who were just looking for love. They were looking to better their lives, and they had that
And then they get
desperation.
it. And then they get sold into this whole lifestyle of like, well, why not just try to meet a lot of women? And
Yeah.
and they go
Why
down
don't you
this
wear a fuzzy hat?
yeah. And when you're in your early 20s, like you don't really know very much. It's not your fault. This is a lot of us were raised by single mothers. We didn't have fathers that, gave us like wisdom about women or life, so we fall into these traps. I didn't have an older uncle around to explain anything, nothing. I was just kind of left to my own devices, like a lot of young men in the West. And so we sort of fall into these traps of like looking for advice on like how to be a man and meet women, and we fall into the hands of these scammers that sell they peddle their ebooks and their e-courses and lectures, and it works because they're selling half truths.
And it's absolutely true. And one thing I noticed, I had gone to a couple meetings with these guys, and there was one thing that they did that I actually think was really clever and probably hurt their chances, was that they said, if you want to meet women, you got to make yourself desirable. Full stop. So it's like there's not really a case where you can be like a sad, ugly guy and get women with the right key phrase. It's like if you're fat, join a gym. A lot of these guys, what I found was that their lives were a mess in a few other ways, and they were like we had talked about. I think they were looking for women to solve that. Like all this is going to fall in line if I get a woman, and obviously it won't.
Well, what happened?
It was just a self-help thing.
Well, self-help sounds really gay, but that's not a wrong way to put it. They. I don't think it's that they're looking to women to solve something, but they're so desperate for a woman that they don't have anything else going on for them, which pushes women away, if that makes sense. Women don't want a man that's just chasing them, because that man, like, what is that? Women want to chase men. That's how it should be. And if a woman isn't chasing you, then you're doing something wrong. If the women you want are not coming to you, then you're not doing it right.
And so I think there's a lot of things that would affect every man within the dating market that might also get kind of offloaded onto the racial identity thing, where it's just a shared thing.
Well, the racial identity thing is, so with race, race is a factor in the sexual dating market, and I think the black-pilled incel type of people are right about some of the race stuff. I think we can all agree as people in this movement that, generally speaking, white people, both men and women, are on average more physically attractive, and that has to do with their individualistic evolution. They're the product of a sort of sexual meritocracy. Their evolution is a product of sexual meritocracy between individuals. So, and Kevin McDonald actually talks about this in the first couple chapters of his book, where the reason why white people are tall, blonde, blue eyes, good looking, and this and that, good phenotypes, is because they sexually selected for these traits. No other races really did. And again, this is the product of individualism. Romantic love is individualistic. Other cultures, so you have like more clannish behavior where your uncle and your aunts and all your cousins get involved in picking your spouse, and you have arranged marriages or concubines, or, China is an example of this. And so the physical attractiveness of other races is considerably lower than that of white people. And so white men, for example, have a much easier time in the sexual marketplace than any other race. And that's just true, and you have to just accept that, whether you're happy about it or not. And the same applies to white. The only race that can compete with white women is Asian women, and most interracial couples today are still, when a white person is involved, it's a white man with an Asian woman, and
it's that or Hispanic. Those are like the top two. It's white,
I think it's
Hispanic,
more often Asian. I'm pretty sure you're right about that.
And you would, because we have people saying, "Oh, that type of Hispanic might count as white." Like you get into weird debates too.
So yeah. Some of them are white looking because they have a significant white admixture, and they could almost be like, in a lot of areas, like not technically white, but they check off a lot of white boxes. Some Hispanic women look white or have white phenotypes,
otherwise known as half of the dissident right.
yeah. There's a lot of silliness on the dissident right. But the thing is, regardless of race, if you can make it to your 30s and you have a purpose in life, you can still get something. Um, you know what I mean? It doesn't have to just because of what white guys are sexually more successful because of their phenotype and their height and this and that doesn't, it doesn't mean you're going to come out empty handed. I guess that's my point.
Yeah, and also you kind of see this on the white side too, because even among white people, there's mutt white people. So a guy like me, I'm half Ukrainian and I'm half Anglo and I'm Canadian. So I got that for a lot of people, for a lot of white people, that's three strikes against me. Like
That's ridiculous.
there's a lot of people who hate Anglos in the scene, who hate just the British. And if you got they're the ones, they put them up there with Jews
Oh
as
my
like the ones
God.
who ruined the West. Whether or not I agree, that's what I hear. So for some people, especially if they're pure blooded, like Scandinavian or something, they're like, you're already a mud. And I think that I'm like, okay, well, am I going to kill myself? No, I guess I better just keep going forward and figure it out. And there's a lot of Americans who are the same way. There's a lot of guys on the distant right in America who are like a little bit of something else, or but they haven't killed themselves or stepped back from the light. So even if you're an imperfect person or whatever we want to describe, it's like, well, what are you going to do about it? And I always ask myself that. I every day I wake up like, what am I doing here? What am I actually trying to do? Who am I? Should I just go away? Should I
No,
shut
you're
up? And
you're 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 a white man, and what people have to understand. So this idea of like the white Amerimont, where he's like half English, German, Irish, whatever, it's not this unprecedented thing within Europe itself. People, different ancient ethnic populations of Europe intermixed. You have people with Scandinavian ancestry all over Europe. So Europeans were the first Euromutts in a sense, and this just goes to show that race is more of a real thing than ethnicity. Not saying that ethnicity isn't an issue; it doesn't matter, but race matters a lot more than that. It's much more significant, and in most cases, as long as it's within race, I don't think white men of one ethnic group or another really like Scandinavian men had no problem having Irish wives, and maybe vice versa in other situations. I think you can put ethnically French or Czech people in English society, and they can come out as English gentlemen because they're white. As long as they're all Northern European and of Indo-European extraction, which most of them are.
yeah, when people talk about, because Europeans will often say this, that white doesn't exist. I do not want to see myself as white alongside you, and they got valid claims for that. But I think what people lose is that this concept of white and Asian and black emerged in multicultural societies, and they will say, "Oh, well, there was no such concept as white going back, 100 years." I'm like, that's true because they weren't living in the circumstances we're living in, and it
It's
seems
relative. Yeah.
yeah, it seems obvious that once you put various white people and various Asian people and various black people together, they will cluster amongst themselves. And we could use prison as an example, but there's all kinds of other examples. It
There's
seems to
concentric
happen.
circles. Yeah. Concentric circles of identity. I mean, you have your family, your ethnic group, your race, and, so on and so forth until you get to like species.
And as much as, Koreans may hate the Japanese, and they might have very valid, very visceral reasons
Yes.
and historical, if you put them in a room full of Africans, they'll be best friends. I'm pretty sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. In America, you see that with the Asian American community.
Yeah, and so I'm like, if we want to call this a new phenomenon, call it a new phenomenon, but it is something that is emerging as we become a more globalized world, whether we want to or not. So I see a lot of people having these conversations. I think they're worth having. When you see more people talking about ethnogenesis, and if you want to expand that out to a racial category, like, what is the future for white people? It won't look like the past. It won't, and maybe you see that. Maybe that's the European Union in many ways, and there's a lot of problems with the European Union. But maybe it, even on a liberal standpoint, they're trying to like look at this like, oh, guys, we got to band together. So, what will the future of white unity be? It won't look like the past, and you'll need new language for it. I think we're trying to figure out what that language is, but I think it's kind of messy right now. You see people talking about this shit, but I'm interested in where this goes.
Yeah, I'm sure within race, new white ethnicities will emerge. will merge together or emerge, whatever. Like we're gonna, even within Europe, you'll probably see, mixing and merging, and the new groups emerging out of that. Just like it was before. Um, who knows? As maybe we head towards a more the collapse of the global economy or something, societies, countries will fracture, and um, even within the current population of any European country, they'll break up into new ethnicities. I mean, it's not, it's not unprecedented.
Yeah.
It's just a process. But race is much more significant than ethnicity is.
It's interesting because one story I'm fascinated with, to show that stuff like this is possible even from an organizational standpoint, was that when I was reading about the history of North America, and there's this group of people called the Métis here in Canada. They are kind of like Indians, but what they were was a racial negotiation between the Indians and the French, because when the French came over, they were arguably just as racist as the Anglos, but they kind of went at a different angle where they said, race is real, ethnicity is real, but we're trying to thrive in this environment. So we're basically going to create a new type of guy. The Métis are a mixed race between French settlers and the Aboriginals here. And that was done on purpose by design. And they made it a whole new type of person. So it was possible back in the day to do things like that. I always found that an interesting case. I think they've kind of settled on their Aboriginal side, but it was fine that this is how they were thinking not even that long ago. They just came to different conclusions because the Anglos were like, no, we got to set up walls and grids to make sure everything's separate.
I think the Anglos had it right. Yeah. As someone that is racially mixed, I'm going to side with the Anglos on that.
Yeah, well, because then you had the Anglos,
Build
then you had the
Don't
Protestants, because at a certain point, from the religious angle, and this is where people would criticize Christianity, where they said, we're building like a Protestant city on a hill, and we're going to try and spread the word to all the races of North America. And so that's kind of led down that path. But yet you still have the waspy people, so it's kind of a contradiction for them.
I'm a descendant of those people. Like literally, those people are my ancestors.
Yeah, like even my bloodline, you can trace.
Your bloodline.
Like my family was Scottish too.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, you're part Anglo. Sorry, I forgot.
Yeah. Well, because it's Anglo and it's kind of a bit of Scottish. It's weird because then Anglo and Scottish wasn't that. You didn't see a lot of opposition to that happened all the time. But Canada's got a fun history racially, because I mentioned this from time to time. It's different than America because despite the fact that in the modern era it's a post-nation state, that's what Trudeau said, it has more ethno-states within it. So most of our Aboriginal / Indian reserves they're their own countries. They have their own laws. And there's stories that I've read in the mainstream news where they've exiled people for race mixing. So if you're, I'm not even joking. I can try and dig them up. But like if you're a woman who had they'll kick you out of that community because they got they'll test how much of that you are. And this is official, kind of like what Israel does to tell if you're like fucking Jewish or whatever. And then you look at Quebec, and Quebec is essentially an ethno state as well. It's francophone, but they have laws on the books to defend French identity. You have to speak French, and you can receive fines if you don't. And these are laws.
It's just cultural. It's just culture. It's a cult, but it's they're looking at it from the cultural angle more than the biological.
Do. But the idea is that you within this framework, you could maybe more than America, because America still has kind of a melting pot ethos. In Canada, despite its progressive nature and liberal nature, there might be more opportunity for ethno states, and that's kind of an angle that I take. I haven't looked too much into it, but I'm like, something's happening here. Like we're so anti-racist that we became racist, and we're just allowing China to just set up little Chinas everywhere in here. And we're like, everyone's okay with this, I guess. Can you do that for white people? Maybe if you slip under the radar. That's kind of what people are looking at up here, but I won't get off on that.
What I wanted to say is, I think coming back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this stream, one of the points I tried to make on my Telegram is that the problem with large government is that it inevitably requires more people to pay for itself. Taxes, a lot of its money comes from taxes. And so it needs more heads, it needs more space, and that gets into a growing government gets into the business of empire. It's multiracial, and this is kind of what you see with America. And so these people that are advocating for stronger government, as they call it, more muscular government, I don't think they understand that, because as a government grows, it takes on more races of people, and it wants cohesion across its entire population, internal cohesion. So it promotes diversity. I think diversity, the promotion of diversity, the facilitation of diversity and immigration is necessitated and facilitated by larger government, more powerful government.
Do you see any way for a large state to kind of create itself where it wouldn't want to kind of bring in the way you might call maybe even a serf class? Because is there a way that a nation, a government, a state of a fairly advanced size and scope could avoid falling in that trap, or do you think that's just inevitable?
I I think ultimately it's inevitable, because if we're talking about like in the long term, I don't think when we talk about like, I don't have a crystal ball, obviously, but when I think about events in the long term, like generations down the road, what are our people going to be dealing with, and how are government systems and civilizations going to work? There's these forces, right? And you could think of it as like forces of entropy or something or whatever. There's these forces at work that are in some cases you could think of them as like incentives. A large government has less, I imagine, and from what I've seen in just living in spending time in Washington D.C., it has a natural incentive to do diversity and bringing in migrant serfs, if you want to call them that, and promoting diversity, than it does to stay on course, being beholden to any specific ideology.
Well, and there's something to that, because a lot of the people on the right will look at the system that we have now as completely miscegenated, deracinated, compromised, and everything, and they might look globally to a place like Russia or a place like China or maybe even like Iran, for example. And then I think there was a rude awakening recently where people kind of conceptualize Russia as this white Slavic state, but then you see the state itself say, no, we're a multicultural state. And then they had to shake their like, what? And then, there's a lot of states that do it. But I even look at China, and China is held up, and correctly so in a lot of ways, as a sort of ethnocentric state. It's very China focused. And they would say, oh, we can model that. I'm not completely convinced that on a long enough timeline that China would remain as ethnocentric as we as outsiders think it is. I think that, they obviously hate religion. They don't like Christians. They don't like Muslims. So they have little camps for that. I'm trying to think of a scenario where China's exploits in Africa, let's say, creates a new sort of Hapa race of Chinese and African. Yeah. So how would China view them? Would China view them as a necessary part of China? I can see them perhaps doing that. So
I think they're trying to do that now. I think that China itself is multi-ethnic. There's this idea that like everybody's Han Chinese, but from what I understand, that's not the actual biological reality. In China, what China is sort of what it is, or what it's trying to do. Imagine if Germany had this giant empire across most of Europe and was trying to convince everyone that they were German. And then you look at the demographic statistics and it says, 95% German, because everybody speaks German. They're an assimilationist empire. And I mean, I'm not an expert on, what's going on in China, but it looks like to me, the only real problem that the Chinese have with these Uyghurs is that they're Muslim. They're not assimilating. If they would just assimilate and try to become Han Chinese people, they wouldn't be in these re-education camps. That's why they're being sent to re-education camps. They're not deporting the Uyghurs. They're re-educating them, because the Chinese are an assimilationist empire. And an ethno state wouldn't be assimilationist. It wouldn't do re-education camps. It would just kick these people out.
And that's an interesting point. And so when people kind of look to these other countries, I say, well, in a lot of ways, I'd used this line before. I'm not sure it's completely accurate, but I would say that in a lot of ways, this sort of Western liberalism is just a test that hasn't been tested on certain countries yet. Like people would look at Muslim countries and look at how culturally strong they are. I'm like, I actually don't see them as particularly culturally strong. I see them as quite easy to subvert. It's just no one's really wanted to subvert them. Same thing with China. It's like, have they been truly tested with, the pressures of global homo, whatever you want to call it, and as an assimilationist culture, would they kind of end up in a similar place, but just call it something different? And I'm not saying that is 100% will happen. I'm sure some people have some thoughts on that, but I do think that people are looking for a foreign nation who kind of rhymes with what they want, hoping that they'll swoop in and save all the white people. And I don't see anyone going in to save Western white people from the outside.
Well, yeah, China's never going to save white people. That's obvious enough. You know that, but China's not even as like if they were trying to like model a powerful enemy or something. I mean, a lot of the cultural problems that the people in the dissident right complain about in the West, I'm pretty damn sure exist in China in some form or another. China's a huge country with a lot of corruption. In a lot of cases, they have problems that we don't have. Fake food everywhere, pollution. It's hard for me to conceive of an ethno state polluting the society its people live in, or taking away their gun rights and surveilling them. So it's
and
just
I
like
wish my co-host could be here, because my co-host, as I'm sure he wanted to be here, he couldn't today, unfortunately, because he was too busy being a gay man. But no, because I think you've talked to him in the past. He speaks very highly of you. He enjoys your content.
Who?
His name's Judas. He says he's talked to you before and felt his like Telegram name is Fat Old Judas. But he's my co-host, and he lives. He's enjoys your content. He likes you,
Okay.
and he
I have to make more.
he lives in Hong Kong. And so he's been on the ground in China, and for we've had this podcast for a few years. We had a whole little episode arc where he was at the Hong Kong protests, so he was giving his like on the ground experiences of what that's like
there. Yeah,
yeah, and he shares. He's probably the most anti-China person you're going to find.
Great, because
and he's telling stories. Yeah, I'd love to. I'm gonna forward you his info, because he was saying, he's like, look, you have no idea how bad it is. Like, there are people who are black bagged and vanned in the middle of the day. He's got quite a few valid theories that a lot of the deaths they reported from COVID were simply the leading party disappearing a lot of political dissidents.
Oh, that sounds so Chinese. God.
Yeah, and he's like, yeah, probably. Like, he was there, and he was the first guy who was telling me, like, look, dude, they're welding people into their apartments, and then it kind of hit the news. But he sees it, he knows people. Even though he's in Hong Kong, he does business in China and would travel to other Chinese cities because it's quite easy to get around there. And he's like, you don't know how weird it is in mainland China.
Oh,
like,
these people in dissident right that envy China and look up to it as some sort of model. I mean, it's just I can't wrap my head around that. And I've never even been to China. I'm half Chinese, but I've never been to China. I just my reference point is just interacting with Chinese descended people here in the West, and I see a genetic psychological continuity between some of the Chinese people here, their psychological nature and their political tendencies, and what you have going on in China. And I'm into the whole Kevin McDonald evolutionary psychology way of looking at race and demographics and behavior. Their evolutionary psychology is different from that of the white man. They don't have that. See, as people of European descent, I'm half, white. You're fully white, but we have this psychology of, martial aristocrat Indo-Europeans that fought for freedom, and they were a moralistic people. individualistic, and all the things that seems like a lot of people in the dissident right are claim that they hate or something.
Yeah.
And then you look at China and their evolution, their biological, their psychological evolution. They're sort of like the original bugmen, because they're an over civilized people, over domesticated. They don't have that Faustian martial will to power spirit.
Yeah, and there's a lot of great thinkers who have remarked on this. I think even Oswald Spengler, sometimes there's some overlap between Oswald Spengler and Julius Evola on how they conceptualize like these broad races of people, because they talk about like what is the Western man and what is there. I think Evola calls it like a prime symbol. Like there's something at the center of your broad European identity that does not transpose well onto the Eastern identity. So I think it was Evola who said it was the conception of the man against nature, the man striking out on his own. And that's the man who climbs the mountain, the individual who goes in the unknown and has an aggressive relationship with it. And that kind of bleeds out into all your mythology, and not only your mythology, but also your architecture. And he said the Eastern man, it was the man among nature. And you actually see that in a lot of Asian architecture where it's inviting nature in. It's a lot of open spaces, a lot of this classic architecture. A lot of the mythology is about men kind of at balance with nature. It's a lot of balancing, it's a lot of nature. Whereas with the Western man, it's almost a violent opposition to nature. And you see this in like these grand spires, which is kind of a violent form of architecture, if you think about it. And you can see how even on the most fundamental level, there is a different way you engage with the world. And just to give you a more nerdy example, if you get into a lot of the esoteric stuff about Hyperborea and things like that, there's a lot of actual very good scholarly academic writing about the way the Indo-European people conceptualize their place in the world. So here's another one. There's this book we covered recently called Arctos, and it's about all these sort of Hyperborean myths and stuff. But in classic Indo-European culture, and they include Indians in this as well, and there's a solid case for that, there's this conception of being in a fallen state. And a fallen state means that you were once great and you're once perfect, and you've kind of fallen and now you're compromised and you're worse. And some people take that literally in the sense of a lot of these really far right white nationalists, where they actually conceptualize white people as we used to be fucking energy beings living in Antarctica. So you can get kind of kooky with it. But the idea of being perfect in the past and kind of being compromised now isn't evident in the Eastern religions. It's this like we are always at balance. The Chinese empire was there for 5,000 years, and it can exist in this perfect balance forever. Whereas with the idea of a downfall is unique to the European idea. Like it's in our fucking DNA. And that's, I think, in my opinion, why Christianity mapped so easily onto it and did not map so easily onto other cultures. Now, that's a whole other argument to get into. But that's something that So now you're seeing that right down in the DNA of how differently you see the world and you see your own place in the world. And that's why, aside from how you dress and aside from all the other folkway stuff, there is something, and maybe it's a different soul, if people want to use that word.
Biospirit. Yeah,
biospirit. There's a lot of that. So I'm like, but there's something there. And it's not just kooky guys like us who've talked about it. There's very serious philosophers who've dealt with this. Yes. There's very serious historians. And I think once you read the stuff, things come into focus. And anyway, that's just my little tangent.
Okay, well, I don't totally buy into the Hyperborea theories. I think it's aesthetically pleasing or whatever, but it's not. It sounds nice, but I think that there's just looking at the history of these people in the history books and sort of trying to map out their psychological evolution. You have the Indo-Europeans coming into Europe and mixing with the Western hunter-gatherers and the Neolithic farmers, and Kevin MacDonald talks about that. And these were a warrior people, and it was a primitive, pre-modern, pre-government sort of world where might makes right, and the men with weapons are in charge because they have weapons, and that's ingrained in our psychology. But the evolution of people in the Far East is that they had centralized big government before a lot of other people. And we're talking like probably before 2000 BC, they had like centralized bureaucracy of some form because they took on to rice farming very early, and they didn't. But they did civilization, I think, in a way that was, it kind of weeded out the warrior, individualistic, Faustian spirit that they might have had. That in a way, like in a more consistent uh, way than you might find in other cultures that took on agriculture and civilization even earlier than the Chinese. Like these people were they had, the Chinese are known for like being, for example, like if you're accused of a crime, you're guilty until proven innocent, right? Like being innocent
Right.
until proven guilty is like a very Western idea, and I mean that has consequences to our evolution psychologically, because this is how the Chinese have been. This is the attitude they've had towards their people for thousands of years, where you just, if anyone stepped out of line, you had these horrific, brutal punishments, torture. People were just genetically bred to be hyper obedient to the state and to not think that they should or could or whatever have anything that would be out of line or give them any power or anything as an individual, and it's the end result of the modern Chinese man, in my view, is someone that just wants to make money and eat noodle soup. And you know what I mean? That's like the extent to his drive or his sense of purpose. It is like the perfect peasant, if you will, the bug man, the worker, the ant,
Yeah, and I think there's something, because people will look at that and they'll say, well, that's good. Maybe that's the ideal state. And I would say that it's much easier to end up in a sort of ossified, dead culture that way. And what I mean by that is that what individuality presents is maybe sort of I don't know, like a recycling feature or a testing feature that, if you empower the individual on the level and give them the capability to practice dissidence, it might actually keep the society, the civilization more vibrant. Right? If you make it so, if people know something is fundamentally wrong, that's what the dissident right is. The dissident
Yeah,
right is a
yeah,
bunch of individuals who kind of cluster together
exactly.
what
It's the
everyone is
product of
telling them not
individualism.
to. Yeah.
Yeah, they're the NPCs in the West are the real authoritarian collectivists. Not these people in the dissident right who are all psychologically. I mean, they're being individualistic. They're going against the grain. Whereas in China, I mean, whatever dissidents they have, as you were talking about earlier, just getting vanned away and disappeared under the guise of COVID or whatever. That's just so Chinese. And when you see the Chinese people I've talked to here in the West that were born and raised in America, I almost they never genuinely value freedom or individualism or rights. They just don't. Like the concept of the Second Amendment is alien to their biospirit. Yes, I've met Chinese people that enjoy shooting guns and going to the range and all that stuff, that like having they like freedom, but they don't respect it. They don't care about preserving it. They don't understand that the purpose of something like the Second Amendment, it's a prohibition on government so that we can have guns against a tyrannical government, defend our freedoms. And that just like blows their fucking mind. They can't, they're not, their biospirit doesn't have an affinity for something like that. And other things too. So excuse me. I'm not saying that there are no East Asian people that value freedom. It's just on average, their psychological disposition sort of pushes them away. They don't value that because they don't have an aristocratic nature to begin with.
And we saw this years and years ago, back when the alt-right was a bit more popular, and you had these sort of civic nationalists. They were always scrambling to find a based version of some type. Oh, look at the based Jews. And so I noticed this early on when they're like, oh, here's the based Chinese, because they're
Oh my
against.
God.
Pretty much, there was a period where if you just scowled your face at black people. We were kind of waving you. We're like, you don't like them either. All right, come here. But I would also warn people, like, they actually don't really align with you on anything. They don't really get what we're doing. We might align on a couple of issues, but especially here in Canada, I'm like, I don't think you understand the Chinese motivations. They have a different agenda. And I don't want to talk about them like they're an extraterrestrial species. But in science fiction, when we talk about like the idea of, I don't think they have motivations that are completely alien to your mental framework right now. So,
it's genetic.
They're not, you're like, oh, they're Chinese immigrants are so pro freedom. I'm like, I don't think they might say the words just to get you to shut up.
Pay them.
Yeah. But they got a goal here it doesn't end up with you just being able to grill.
Well, it's like the way I see it, and I'm not trying to like flatter myself because I'm American. I mean, I am American, but I think this sort of exists across the West. But you have a higher concentration of white people in the United States that have this sort of like Indo-European warrior spirit. I kind of conceive of heritage white Americans as being a nation of Indo-European warriors that want to keep their spears. The modern equivalent would be an infantry rifle, and it's this warrior caste identity made real, like they want to actually be the thing, not in some figurative sense, but they actually are a warrior caste of people, and that's why they value freedom and rights, because they want to maintain that culture, that identity, that real martial potential within the framework of modern civilization, with its courts and police and judges. But no other race of man can conceive of that or understand that, or they don't buy into that because they're not of Indo-European extraction.
Yeah, and this is also something I think Oswald Spengler was talking about in Man and Technics. There's been various philosophers who've kind of dealt with this about being the man who stands apart when everything's kind of falling apart, and that there's certain people who are kind of cut out for that, and there's certain people that aren't. But yeah, there's all. Yeah, I'm not to get into like a whole theory downward spiral here.
I wanted to touch on the thing you said about nature, like the Asian people invite nature, and the white man is going. I don't think the white man is resistant to nature or something. The white man as he is a product of nature. It is our nature. And to me, I look at the Asian bug man as a force against nature. That he is like. He because my perspective is that urbanization domesticates man, and that these people have had urban civilization for much longer than a lot of other races, especially the Northern European man. And so they're actually more unnatural. And the Northern European man is actually more of a force is more in tune with nature than the Chinese man.
Yeah, I've seen that, especially recently. I was more talking about like in a very, very historical sense. And this was, I believe that's what was in, I'm pretty sure it was Evola who was saying that. But I do, like, there is a lot of, if you look around at the world right now you just see, especially China as a great example, like they seem to just like torturing nature for the fun of it. And I think there has been almost like a renaissance, like an environmentalist renaissance that's currently happening on the right now. And I like it, because I think if there's one thing that, maybe it's just the Industrial Revolution that we're kind of trying to clean up the pieces from that. But I do see now more than ever, especially in Scandinavia, and we covered, Linkola recently, who is a kind of called an eco-fascist, even though I wouldn't call him like a fascist in any way. But there's sort of like a radical environmentalism that I see gaining wider acceptance now, which I don't dislike, because I do think that we got a pretty good relationship with nature, and especially because we actually like being around nature. And once you're around black people and brown people, you're like, oh, you guys don't even like nature. Like, we like camping. We play homeless for fun for a while.
Oh gosh. Well, the Western man, I think, has more of an appreciation for nature than they're the ones actually inviting nature, and I think that compared to the Chinese man, they are more in tune with nature, because they have a more visceral respect for might makes right, if you will, in a way that I think Chinese people don't, and they they don't. So the white man, because of his evolution, and Northern Europe was always more rural than other parts of the world, maybe until recently. He needs more space. He needs trees. The Western hunter gatherers evolved out of the forests, and we have that in our admixture. Um, the forest folk, if you will, mixing with the Indo-Europeans, and so Northern Europeans are a rural people, psychologically, genetically, biospirit wise, whatever, and other races of people, especially the Chinese, are not. And even when they can come to the West and buy lots of land, they prefer to own space in the cities, and anything outside of a city to a lot of Chinese people is like, oh my God, you're leaving civilization. And they're not fond of rural environments. And I think with Black people too, you kind of see, like in a Western environment, you see this. A lot of immigrants, Black, Arab, Chinese, they want to be in the cities where they can hustle and haggle, and this is what facilitates their existence. And for Blacks, being attached to like government jobs and government welfare. Government jobs are a form of welfare. I don't care what anyone says about that. This is what facilitates their survival in a world that, for Black people, civilization is not something they created. It's just something they sort of exist in. So they need it to facilitate their existence more than the white man that actually built it. And what I'm trying to kind of get across to people in the dissident right is, if you want to get rid of these people, you have to change. You have to stop keeping up the environments that facilitate their existence. Get rid of the cities or abandon them. Leave it to these people.
Yeah, I'd always joke with my friends about they'll never understand the unique Anglo desire to see a forest and just want to wander into it. Just because I see it every time. Because
it's a Northern European desire. It's not just an Anglo.
Yeah, yeah. Because every time I live in Canada, so there's a lot of nature up here, and I think a lot of people are really startled when they get here to see how much of just expanse of trees there are. Whereas even in a lot of America, there's a lot of cities very tightly close together.
Well, no, there's a lot of land in America. There's a lot of land. I mean, in North America in general. I mean, most of America is uninhabited and rural. I mean, I'm not just saying this to defend America. I mean, Canada, of course, has even fewer people and more land than the United States, but the United States is still very rural.
Canada is one place where there's nothing going on. It's mostly you go into the forest and you can find, maybe there's guys living in there we don't know about. That's why I actually like Canada, because I've always talked to people. I'm like, Canada more than any other country, maybe Russia would, but Canada facilitates this idea that maybe you just disappear in the fucking woods, because we don't have a lot of park rangers either.
Yeah, based. But so this ties into the Chinese issue. You have a lot of Chinese in places like Vancouver, but they probably stick to the cities. You go like I'm sure even in Canada, in places where you have diversity, like you go to a nearby park, and the majority of the people you'll see on these trails, or really going into the woods, are white people.
It's interesting because on one hand, I like to fight against the people who say that. And I think you'll probably agree with this once I get, because you might disagree with that at the start, but I think you'll agree with it, that there's a political movement on the right where it's like everyone just run into the woods and live in a cabin alone, basically be the Unabomber. And that's the best way to do it. I actually do think the best way to survive is on a community and familial way. But I do think there's something to be said where, even from a political standpoint, this idea that white people especially have the desire to strike out into their own and kind of rough it in the forest, in the woods, in a survivalist sense. Like the idea of survivalism appeals to us. I think if you were to look at the communities of even doomsday preppers, I think you're going to find a lot of white people. It's what we busy ourselves.
It's 99% white people. And you know what? If there was a total collapse and people were starving, I think it would turn a lot of these a lot of countries into white ethno states because the only survivors would be white people.
Yeah, think back to every doomsday movie you've seen. It's always the white guys, even running the bad gangs, but they're the ones who fucking figured it out in some
They
way.
have and they have the guns, so they can just take over.
Yeah, so I think from even a political and maybe even ethno state standpoint, I don't want people to lose that. I don't want people to lose this, and you can even claim this as liberalism if you want, but there's part of the white guy who wants to know that he can go into the woods alone and survive. And that no matter how collectivist our political dreams might be, like, I don't think you can lose that. And I think that's a technique, that's an action, that's a thing you can do. And I don't think if we surgically remove that from us, I don't see a good
That would be a
outcome.
mistake.
Yeah.
Well, I think the dichotomy between individualism and collectivism is it's really a false dichotomy in the context of white people, because this sort of behavior is a product. The individualism of Europeans is actually a product of collectivism itself, because you had to, because we were individualistic, the individualism it ties into the virtue signaling nature of whites, and this is how they communicated to each other that I'm a good person and you can trust me, because we didn't have clannish societies. I mean, we could get into the whole chicken and egg thing, like which came first, this sort of behavior, individualism. But the individualism is a part of the collectivist dynamic of white people, if you will. And it goes back and forth. It's not completely like a separate thing if you look at it from psychological terms. And I'm sure Kevin McDonald could expand on this, but white Europeans, the glue of ancient white societies as a collective was individualism plus virtue signaling, and that it's there's a harmony to it that makes it work, rather than like living in a clannish society in the Middle East or something where everybody was marrying their cousins and you had no meritocracy because you would only hire your cousins, and that's dysgenic, right? The reason why whites are better at a lot of things and created the modern world and all of science is because they of individualism. You can't have meritocracy without individualism, and breeding for meritocracy and high IQs and so on. So anyway, I'm digressing a little bit there, but
no, but that's good, because I over when I talk to people that I find very interesting, I find that there's a lot of apprehension to throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and that's good. Because one thing I see, especially on whatever we call this thing, the dissident right, which is, I use these terms very broadly when I say dissident right. So that would include also a lot of pagans, a lot of trad cats, whatever. So, but I see a lot of people who throw the baby out with the bathwater. They say, I don't like the way things are now, so we must, as much as either it's like time machine nationalism. Either go back and destroy everything and start over, with new principles. This is kind of like futurism too, in a way. Start with completely new principles. Everything that got us here has to be thrown out. And I am like, I don't get that. I don't think, but to fight against that, you really need to do your research. You need to dive into
what got us here. What got us here? I'm sorry to cut you off. What got us here? What got us here is not rights or liberalism or individualism or anything like that. It's just the problems of a modern civilization. And I think I don't agree with what the elites are doing, but I think they're right when they talk about overpopulation. I just don't like the fact that they're going about it in this way where they're replacing white people and feeding third world and Africans, and the African population is exploding. So the elites don't really care about the overpopulation. It's kind of just, I think, a trick to reduce the number of white people or something. But a lot of things in the world that worked for us in the past are not going to work at all. Nothing we want will really work in a modern, overpopulated, urban-centric world or society.
what's the best way forward. Is Hapaboria on the table? I've been thinking about all the Hapas. I know you don't think it's an identity. Here's the thing, though, it can be, and you got to start a new homeland in the North Pole.
I think they would all kill each other. I'm not going to the North Pole. Too cold for me, man.
I my ethno state over the course of the years, it's like, yeah, but we're going to allow Latinas and we're going to allow
Oh
every.
no.
I'm a
Oh
man of multitudes.
no. Let's keep it white. But but all right.
It's
Hey
just a
man,
joke,
you do you.
everyone. But also, one thing, we got to get end the show because I do need to eat. I need to eat lunch and urinate, and probably at the same time. But one thing I wanted to ask you before we go, and so yeah, you said, I said the few episodes before these interviews are going on pretty long, and you said you couldn't. Here we are, an hour and a half.
You know, I could go on a little longer. Yeah,
I think you're having a whale of a time.
Wicked sick.
I am. We got to do this again. This is
Yeah.
fun.
I wanted to ask you about you're a gun guy. I'm a gun guy too. I live in Canada, and I've been waiting 8 months to get my gun license, which is apparently
Oh,
in the mail
fuck.
still. I know this is.
And people say the Second Amendment doesn't matter. Well, screw those people. You know,
I don't. They're going to say it's COVID, but I'm like, I passed it. I had to take a course to do it. I had to take a written and
That's
practical
so
course,
retarded.
and
Fuck
then I'm just waiting. It was just so you know, if anyone's interested, the way you do it where I live in Ontario, it's you have to take a course, and the courses are run by gun guys, so they have an interest in passing people, so that helps you.
That's
It's
good,
usually
at least.
an old white guy, but it's like you got to set aside like a day and go and take a day long course, and essentially the course is, the rules to have a gun, and the rules to have a gun are don't shoot yourself in the mouth, and that's about it. And
Really? That's it in Canada.
yeah, it's about gun safety. So it's like, okay, here's how you load it. Here, don't look down it when it's loaded. Don't point at other people when you're not using basic shit that probably you guys everyone knows. But then you have to show how to load shotgun, rifle, fucking what's it called, a bolt action rifle, and then rifle with magazine, and I think that's about it. Only those 3 guns. Show how to load, unload, take it out, clean it, but done. And then you get your fucking thing in the mail. It's a whole process. It costs a bunch of money. But the reason I say this is because I know you're a gun guy. Do you have any guns that you like? Do you own any? Do you have any picks?
Well, I don't know what the feds are listening, right? They probably already know.
Yeah. Shit.
So
I'll start by saying, like, hey, everyone, Fed, I have my eye on, what is it here? It's a Norinco M14.
nice, very nice. In Canada, they didn't. The interesting thing about Canada, the one thing you guys do have is you're allowed to have some of the Soviet weapons or like Chinese. Like you can get a QBZ or something. Certain imports that are banned here in the U.S. So you
that was the one thing, and we just recently banned, I think in Ontario, just Ontario though, but the AR-15, and just because it was a meme gun. But the thing about a lot of people don't know about Canada is you can get pretty much any gun you want. Like no full auto, just like in America. I don't think you get full auto.
No, full auto is legal in America. It just costs as much as a car, and you have to get an ATF tax stamp.
That's it. I did not know that,
so
but
almost nobody owned ones because like who the hell has like $25,000 laying around? Only in places where people are rich do you find gun stores that carry full autos. So it's just a thing that, like,
only the whites
or just rich people. Yeah, rich people. These sort of gun controls just benefit rich people. But sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and also handguns. We have you have to get an extra separate license if you want a handgun. It's non-restricted and then restricted. Restricted gun is the handgun, but within that you get your pretty much anything you want, any kind of handgun. Because I say this because there's certain people out there who say, "Oh, you can't own a handgun in Canada." You can. It's just annoying to get it, but you could get pretty much everything except they banned the AR-15. I think they might have banned it in like a couple of, like, New York or something might have banned it.
There are some areas of the U.S. where some of these guns are banned, or it's like heavily restricted, and you got to do this and that. So the Second Amendment, depending on which state you live in the U.S., is in effect to varying degrees. It's weird. It's already a compromised law. Like a lot of people, especially in the dissident right, I need to make a post like the dissident rights guide to the Second Amendment because a lot of people don't understand it, and
That'd be
they'll
very
try to,
useful, actually.
yeah, they'll trash the Second Amendment by saying, "Well, I don't need a document to give me rights," and they don't understand that the Second Amendment doesn't give you the right to own a gun. It's a prohibition on government. It says the government shall not do gun control. It's a limitation placed on government. That's what the Second Amendment is. And, it's still 80% effective in most of the red states. If it was in full effect, we could own machine guns from vending machines or something, and I would be fine with that. That would be great. But it's still legally binding. It's still like, these people that are saying that the Second Amendment doesn't matter, like, and if some of these people own guns, they don't understand that this is what's stopping the SWAT teams from raiding their house because it got banned. Their gun got banned, and it's protecting them. These rights are a legally real thing. It's a legal obstacle to the government that wants to take everything away from you.
Let me ask you this, and maybe we can end on this, but what, in your view, is the future of the Second Amendment? It's always under attack, as I'm sure you've known. Are you optimistic about it in the future existing?
Yes and no. I'm optimistic in the sense that it seems like the pro-gun movement is stronger than it's ever been, and a lot of I follow the gun community on YouTube, and it's all these white guys, no Chinese guys. There's one black guy, but and they are no compromise. They're not dumb normie con consumers. This meme that pro gun people are like Zionist boomer Republicans. It's just bullshit. It just is bullshit. They might not be woke on. Of course they're not. Even if they're woke on other issues, they're not going to talk about it because there's that's dangerous for obvious reasons. But they're focused on the gun issue. The gun community is like 100,000 times bigger than the dissident right. They have more political weight. There's more hope of preserving gun rights than, say, pushing. There's more hope for the Second Amendment, I think, in the current political paradigm than getting legislation that people in the dissident right would want for America. If that makes any sense. The gun community is fucking huge, and they have a lot of power and money, grassroots money, by the way. The elites obviously do not support the Second Amendment, or the ruling class rather. So you have these like you have these organizations like the FPC. It's a bunch of lawyers, and they exist on donations, and they take issues to the Supreme Court, and they win cases. There's the legal victories for the Second Amendment. States are doing constitutional carry. So in the near future, I'm very optimistic about gun rights increasing in America. But in the long term, as America becomes less white, the only way to preserve the Second Amendment would be for heritage Americans and all these other ethnic groups to sort of balkanize into their own little countries. So you might have white heritage America will keep the Second Amendment, and African America might do away with it.
I think that's interesting because I was always wondering how much should the Second Amendment be a pillar of white activism in maybe North America, but especially America.
In America, but I think even in Canada, I don't understand why the dissident right either criticizes the Second Amendment. They'll say it's like a crutch, or they'll say stupid things like, "I don't need the government to tell me that I can have a gun," blah blah blah. And then they live in a country where it's totally banned, and obviously they don't want to go to fucking prison.
Yeah.
So it's like, they're just speaking out of their fucking ass. But it's like, in a modern civilized world with laws and courts, because we don't live in the dark ages with roaming manor bonds, and if you want something, you just go and take it. We don't live in that world. Rights matter.
And I think we can probably end on that, because that's a very, very good place to end on. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much, Mr. Perspective. And I was wondering if there's anything you'd like to mention or plug or shill, any projects, you can obviously do so now.
I just, if if people like what I have to say, they can follow me on Telegram. And I hope to do this again. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I did as well. And that Telegram is HapaPerspective. He also has a chat where people can discuss these things further. And because of Telegram, you'll probably find both of us floating around and getting into fights.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. And I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.